Tell me where the money went, Viveca. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft pneumatic hiss. Then came the sound she hadn't been bracing for, a deliberate, unhurried click as Ottavio Drago reached past her to the steel override panel and keyed in his private code. The elevator car stilled between the 38th and 39th floors, suspended in the shaft of Drago Tower like an insect caught in amber, while all of downtown Toronto burned cold and white 40 stories below. An ice storm had been grinding against the city since sundown, coating every surface in a glassy, treacherous shell. Through the elevator's narrow pane of tempered glass, the CN Tower was barely visible, a smear of red light dissolving into grey. Viveca Holst stood with her back 3 inches from the mirrored wall and her hands folded in front of her uniform. She was still wearing her housekeeping supervisor's vest, the dark navy one with the Drago Tower crest embroidered on the chest, because she hadn't had a chance to clock out when Ottavio's head of security had appeared at the service entrance 20 minutes ago and told her, quietly and without explanation, that Mr. Drago required her presence on the 40th floor. She hadn't asked questions. You didn't, not in this building. There's been a discrepancy, Ottavio said. He was standing close enough that she could smell the cedar and dark smoke of his cologne, something expensive with no name on the bottle. He didn't raise his voice. Men like Ottavio Drago had never needed to. At 43, he moved like a man who owned every room he walked into, which, technically, he did. He owned Drago Tower outright. He owned the hotel, the parking structure, the restaurant on the ground floor that served the best osso buco in the city. He owned the laundry contracts, the linen suppliers, the service elevators, including the one they were standing in now. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair going silver at his temples. He wore a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for his exact measurements, and a watch on his left wrist that cost more than Viveca's mother's house in Scarborough. There was a pale scar that ran from the corner of his left jaw down toward his collar, old, faded, the kind that told a story it had no intention of explaining. Viveca met his eyes and kept her chin level. What kind of discrepancy? The kind that involves $87,000 disappearing from the linen services account over 6 weeks. He tilted his head, and then reappearing briefly in a holding account under a company name I don't recognize, before someone froze the transfer entirely. His gaze moved over her slowly, not the contemptuous sweep she'd learned to brace for in service jobs since she was 16, but something altogether more concentrated and deliberate. Ottavio Drago looked at Viveca the way a chess player studied a board mid-game. That someone used a hospitality billing override code, accessible only to department supervisors and above. The silence in the elevator was absolute. She could feel the faint mechanical hum of the cable through the floor beneath her shoes. "I know it was you," he said softly. She had known, when she'd done it, that this moment was coming. She'd calculated for it. She'd rehearsed every version of this conversation while refolding a trolley of bath linens on the 22nd floor at midnight, tightening her arguments, preparing herself to deliver them clearly and without flinching. What she hadn't fully accounted for was the way he looked at her. Viveca Holst was 26 years old and built the way the women in her family had always been built. Solid and heavy through the hips and thighs, with a full chest and a soft rounded stomach and arms she'd spent years learning not to hide beneath her uniform sleeves. She took up space, she always had. At 270 pounds, she had spent most of her adult life in rooms where people looked through her or past her, where she was the housekeeper, the woman restocking the minibar, the one who disappeared when the important guests arrived. She was the invisible weight in every room. But Ottavio Drago had never once looked through her. From the first week she'd been promoted to supervisor, 8 months ago, by a manager who'd noted with visible surprise that her efficiency scores were the highest in the department. Drago had noticed her. She'd caught him watching from the mezzanine level during her pre-dawn linen audit. She'd felt his attention during the quarterly staff briefing, where she'd flagged a bottleneck in the morning turnover schedule that had been costing the hotel 2 hours of labor every shift. He'd said nothing then. He'd simply looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, with the same quality of attention he was giving her now. "I need you to tell me exactly what you did," he said, "and why." "I didn't steal from you." The words came out steady, which surprised her a little. "If I'd wanted to steal from you, Mr. Drago, I would not have hidden it in the one account you'd check first, and then frozen it so it couldn't move anywhere." She lifted her chin. "I would have been on a flight to Halifax." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something more careful than suspicion. "Then explain it." 4 weeks ago, I was reconciling the monthly linen usage reports against the vendor invoices. Something I do every month because your previous supervisor apparently didn't, and the discrepancies had been accumulating for 2 years. She kept her voice level, the same tone she used training new staff, clear and precise. I found a pattern. Small overbillings. $40 here, $120 there, spread across 7 different vendor accounts. Nothing that would flag automated auditing. But added across the full billing cycle, the total was significant. Ottavio had gone very still. He was watching her with complete, unsettling focus. "I traced the vendor accounts," Viveca continued. 4 of the 7 were registered through a shell company, Ardent Hospitality Solutions. It doesn't exist. The address is a mailbox in Etobicoke. She paused. The money wasn't going to Ardent, though. Ardent was a pass-through. The actual destination was a numbered holding company with a registered director in Hamilton. She watched Ottavio's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "The transfers were being authorized from inside this building," she said. "From the private billing server on the 39th floor, the one that requires department head credentials or above." She let that land. "Your logistics director, Renato, had been approving the vendor payments manually, bypassing automated verification. But when I traced the authorization logs, the routing instructions for the shell company weren't coming from Renato's terminal." "Where were they coming from?" His voice dropped half a register. "I'll get to that." She reached into the collar of her uniform vest, between the weight of her chest and the stiff linen of her undershirt, and withdrew a small USB drive, matte black, barely the length of her thumb. It had been warm from her body heat. When I understood what I was looking at, I knew I couldn't report it through normal channels, because whoever was routing money to Hamilton had access to the same internal network as your head of HR, your head of security. She held the drive out. If I'd walked into the wrong office with this, I would have walked directly into the office of the person I was reporting. Ottavio looked at the drive, then at her face. "So you froze the account yourself?" "I flagged Ardent Hospitality as a fraudulent vendor through the hotel's billing dispute protocol. It's a legitimate process. Any supervisor can initiate it. It freezes the account pending a compliance review. The $87,000 is sitting in a suspended transfer queue. It cannot be moved, accessed, or deleted without a compliance officer's override code." She met his gaze without blinking. "Which I have. No one else at this hotel holds the second authorization key. I didn't take your money, Mr. Drago. I locked it in a box so no one else could take it either, and I kept the key until I could get it to you." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she could hear tiny ice crystals clicking against the glass pane. Ottavio took the USB drive from her fingers. His hand was large, the knuckles carrying old scars that told a story his suit tried to contradict, and as his fingers closed over the drive, they briefly closed over hers as well. Barely a second, but it felt much heavier than its length. "Renato approved the payments," he said slowly, "but the routing instructions didn't come from Renato's terminal." "No." Who had access to the server room on 39? She had rehearsed this part most carefully of all. 3 people: you, your head of EAT, Coletti, who's been on medical leave since November. She paused, and Enzo Cavallo. It was like watching the surface of a lake go smooth just before something large moved beneath it. Ottavio didn't react visibly. He didn't flinch or move. He simply went perfectly, absolutely still, in the way that large and dangerous men sometimes did when their minds were working faster than their faces wanted to show. "Enzo," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't yet an accusation. It was the sound of a man saying the name of someone he had trusted with his life for 20 years while something irrevocable shifted inside him. "The data's on the drive," Viveca said quietly. "The IP logs, the routing metadata, the time-stamped access records. He routed the first transfer the same night you flew to Vancouver for the Harbor Center meeting, when your location could be confirmed elsewhere." She hesitated, the first hesitation she'd allowed herself. "There's also a file, communications between the Ardent account and a contact at the Hamilton operation. They're not only about money, there's a service contract in there." She held his gaze. "With a private security firm out of Brampton. The contract has a performance clause." Ottavio's voice was barely above a murmur. "What kind of performance clause?" "The kind that gets triggered when a named target doesn't make it to his 55th birthday." The ice clicked against the glass. The city glittered 40 stories below. Viveca could feel the tremor in her own hands now, the adrenaline catching up with the steady voice she'd been forcing for the past 20 minutes. Then the elevator moved. Not from below, not the ordinary cable motion of a lobby call. The override panel beside Ottavio emitted a short electronic tone, and the car began to descend, not toward the lobby, but toward 39. And Viveca understood, with a slow-spreading cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside, that someone else in this building held override access to this elevator. There was exactly one other person in Drago Tower who did. She had approximately 4 seconds to say it. "Mr. Drago." "I know." He had already moved, stepping between her and the doors. The doors opened on 39. Enzo Cavallo stepped in. He was 62, silver-haired, dressed in a dark wool overcoat he wore, like a man who had spent decades in rooms where elegance served as its own form of armor. He had the kind of unremarkable, pleasant face that could sit across a boardroom table for 20 years without anyone feeling uneasy. He'd passed Viveca twice in the building, once at an all-staff meeting, once in a corridor near the service entrance when she'd been pushing a linen trolley, and he'd held the door open with a grandfatherly nod. She'd thanked him. He'd smiled. He was holding a Sig Sauer in his right hand with the ease of someone who had held one many times before. "Ottavio," Enzo said, in the tone of a man who was genuinely sad about something. He stepped fully into the car and let the doors slide shut behind him. "I have the building override code because you gave it to me, because you trusted me with everything." His eyes flicked briefly to Viveca, a dismissive sweep, the kind she had spent her whole life recognizing, the kind that catalogued and discarded in under a second. "I didn't expect to find the housekeeper involved." "She's more than that," Ottavio said. His voice was flat and cold, and he hadn't moved his eyes from Enzo. Evidently, Enzo looked at Viveca again, and this time there was something sharper in his expression. "Those routing logs were triple encrypted. I designed the protocol myself. How did you get through it?" The gun was pointed at Ottavio's chest. Viveca forced her voice to stay level. "I didn't touch the encryption. I documented the physical server access log, the paper one in the room itself, the one you sign when you enter. You signed it 5 times in the past 6 weeks. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning." She held his gaze. "I matched the timestamps." Enzo looked at her for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. Then he exhaled, genuine, exhausted, and redirected the gun toward Ottavio's face. I didn't want it to go this way. You were supposed to be at the harbor dinner. The car was arranged." "Who arranged the car?" Ottavio said. "I did, as I have for 30 years. Something hollowed out in Enzo's voice. Not cruelty, but a bone-deep weariness. "I'm 62 years old, Ottavio. I want to stop. The Hamilton people offered me enough to retire properly. All they needed were the port routes, a few names, a few schedules. It didn't have to go this far. But then the money froze, and the contract couldn't complete." He steadied himself. "Give me the drive." "Enzo." Ottavio took one step forward. Just one, deliberate. "You were at my father's funeral. You were the one who told me to hold the family together. You put your hands on my shoulders and you told me I was capable of it. I know what I said to you," the gun held steady, "and I meant it. But I am tired, Ottavio. I have been tired for years, and you never." Viveca moved. She had no plan. What she had was the understanding, sudden and absolute, that the conversation was finished and Enzo was going to fire in the next half-second. And Ottavio had nothing in his hands because he was a man who had never had to defend himself against the person he trusted most. On the corner ledge of the elevator's service panel, bolted to the wall at her right shoulder, sat the stainless steel emergency case that Drago Tower's maintenance protocols required in every elevator car. It was bolted but not locked. She had restocked its first aid contents herself 3 weeks ago as part of her quarterly safety audit. She knew exactly how heavy it was. She wrenched it off the wall and threw it at Enzo's gun hand with everything she had. The case connected with a sound like a wrench on a pipe. Enzo roared. The gun discharged, a sharp, shockingly loud crack in the enclosed space, and the bullet punched through the elevator ceiling above Ottavio's left shoulder, raining down a fine dust of insulation foam. Viveca didn't wait to see if Enzo recovered his grip. She had 270 pounds of mass, and she used all of it. She drove her full weight into him, shoulder first, the way her older brother had demonstrated in their mother's backyard in Scarborough when she was 15, and he was trying to explain, clumsily and with love, why she should never feel small. She slammed Enzo into the stainless steel back wall of the elevator with an impact that rattled the entire car in the cable. The gun skittered across the floor. Enzo was wiry and strong for his age, but he was 62 and she had just driven every cubic centimeter of air from his lungs. He clawed at her sleeve, her shoulder, hunting for leverage. She grabbed his wrist with both hands and drove it upward against the wall above his head, pressing the full weight of her chest and hips and thighs into him, refusing to give him a centimeter to work with, breathing in ragged, furious gasps. "Ottavio." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ottavio Drago crossed the elevator in a single stride and hauled Enzo off the wall with the effortless brutality of a man who had not always conducted his business in boardrooms. He wrenched the older man's arm behind his back and drove him face first into the corner, holding him there with one forearm across his shoulders and his full weight behind it. Enzo sagged. "The drive is evidence," Ottavio said, his voice perfectly even. "You will not disappear tonight. You'll be handed to people who are extremely interested in the Hamilton operation. A beat. Consider that the mercy it is." He bent, picked up the gun, and pocketed it without looking away from Enzo. The elevator was very quiet. Viveca stood against the opposite wall with both palms flat against the cold steel behind her, breathing. Her shoulder was going to bruise badly. She could already feel the deep ache radiating from the point of impact. Her uniform vest had torn at the left seam. Her hair, which she had pinned up neatly 12 hours ago at the start of her shift, had come mostly undone. Ottavio pressed the intercom panel with one hand, keeping Enzo pinned with the other. He spoke 2 sentences in a low, unhurried voice. She caught only the floor number and a last name, and then released the button and turned to look at her. He looked at her the way he had before Enzo arrived, but stripped now of all the careful control that usually sat over his expression like a second skin. What was underneath it was unguarded, and Viveca felt it move through her like a change in the weather. "Your shoulder," he said. "It's fine." "It isn't." He crossed toward her and very carefully, very deliberately, moved her torn collar aside to look at the joint beneath. His fingers were warm against her neck. "You threw yourself at an armed man." "I threw a metal box at an armed man." That part was calculated. She could hear that her voice wasn't entirely steady anymore. The adrenaline was finishing its work and leaving something shaky behind it. The tackle was more of an instinct. "An instinct," he repeated. "He was going to shoot you." Ottavio looked at her for a moment without speaking. His hand hadn't moved from her collar. "I have people on my payroll whose entire purpose is to make sure that doesn't happen. None of them were in this elevator." "No." Something in his voice roughened at the edges. "They weren't." 2 floors below, she heard the mechanical sound of doors opening, his security team responding to the intercom call. In a few minutes, Enzo would be removed, and there would be calls to make and damage to contain, and the whole complex machinery of Ottavio Drago's life would grind into motion around this moment. She was aware of all of it, distantly, the way you were aware of street noise when you were standing very still on the sidewalk. "The drive has everything," she said. "The Hamilton contacts communications, the shell company registry, the server access logs, the performance contract." She paused. "Everything I could pull. I don't know whether the Hamilton crew will come looking once they realize the contract wasn't completed." "They will," Ottavio said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who understood exactly how that world worked. "Which means you cannot go back to your apartment tonight." His eyes moved over her face with the same thorough attention he'd given her from the moment they stepped into this elevator together, or for some time after. She held his gaze. "Mr. Drago." "Ottavio." The instruction was quiet and absolute. Viveca let out a slow breath. "What happens now?" He was quiet for a moment. The security team's voices reached them from below, professional, clipped, waiting. Enzo hadn't moved from the corner. The city outside was still sealed in ice. "Now," Ottavio said, "I spend the next 72 hours dismantling the arrangement Enzo built with Hamilton. Piece by piece, I make the appropriate calls about the contract that was placed." His hand finally dropped from her collar, slowly, as though he was conscious of each centimeter. "And you," he stopped, reconsidered. "You have spent 8 months in this building noticing things no one else noticed. You found in 4 weeks what my security team hadn't found in 6. You protected evidence at significant personal risk. You broke a triple encrypted routing protocol using a paper sign-in ledger." "It was a fairly obvious gap in the system," she said carefully. "It was, which means you are either the most dangerous person in this tower," the edge of something almost warm crossed his expression, "or the most valuable. I've decided it's the latter." He held her gaze steadily. "I need a head of internal compliance. The position has been vacant without my fully realizing it. I would like it filled by someone whose judgment I would trust with my life." He paused. "Given that you have now saved it, you have a verified record on that front." Viveca looked at him. The elevator hummed faintly beneath her feet. Below, his team was patient. "That's not a small thing to offer," she said. "No," Ottavio agreed, "it isn't." He didn't look away from her, neither was what you did tonight. She thought about her mother's house in Scarborough, where the kitchen ceiling had leaked since 2019, and the landlord still hadn't fixed it. She thought about the years of being invisible in rooms that never once looked back. She thought about the night 4 weeks ago when she'd sat alone in the staff locker room at 2 in the morning, staring at a paper ledger entry, and understood exactly how much trouble she was about to choose. She had chosen it anyway. "The 87,000, she said. "What about it?" the compliance review code, the second authorization key. You'll need it to release the frozen transfer back into the correct account. Ottavio looked at her steadily. Are you negotiating? I'm clarifying procedure. She reached into the left pocket of her uniform vest, below the Drago Tower crest, and produced a folded slip of paper with a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence written in her neat, careful handwriting. The key is here. The drive has everything else. She held both out to him. All of it. No conditions. He took them without looking down at them. He was looking at her. I know, he said. That's why I'm offering you the position. When the elevator finally descended and the doors opened on the 39th floor, Viveca Holst walked out into a corridor full of Ottavio Drago's security team, with her torn uniform and her bruised shoulder and her hair falling loose around her face, and not one of them looked past her. She was aware with a strange and grounded clarity that from this point forward, none of them ever would. Did Viveca make the right call, risking everything to protect a man whose world runs entirely in shadow, or did she just trade one kind of invisible life for a far more dangerous one? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're here for stories about women who refuse to disappear, make sure you're subscribed to Mafia Heart and Me for more.